Hello and welcome to the PE Insights podcast, conversations about PE with me, your host, Nathan Walker. Really excited today to introduce our guest, Dr. Gary Standinger. Standinger, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
Don't want to offend you by saying your name wrong at the start of the podcast. Gary's a teaching fellow in physical education at the University of Edinburgh, with 12 years of experience of teaching PE at a secondary academy in southwest England. And he's recently completed his doctoral thesis. Congratulations, Gary. Achieving mastery, an involved grounded theory of lead learners' views on feedback and assessment. He's done this thesis through Loughborough University. Gary's research interests span youth voice, feedback literacy, and student agency, with a particular focus in secondary education. So get ready for an insightful conversation. And Gary, welcome to the PE Insights.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you for having me this morning.
Absolutely. Yeah, pleased to have you on. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So kick us off with telling us a little bit about your educational journey so far.
Yeah, like many aspiring PE teachers and coaches, I love primary and in particular secondary school PE at Newquay Ferris. A big shout out, if I may, Nathan, to Newquay Ferris School in Cornwall. And my PE teachers, Mr. Higginson, Mr. Croker, Mr. Barker, Mr. Booth, Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Pearce, who inspired and quietly encouraged me throughout my time in secondary and sixth form. So a huge thank you to all of them. And I wouldn't be where I am today without their guidance and support at the beginning of this journey. I studied GCSE followed by A-level PE before heading to the University of Gloucestershire to study sport and exercise science. And it was at Cheltenham and Gloucester that my passion for teaching and research began. I enjoyed studying anatomy and physiology, biomechanics, environmental physiology, to name a few. But it was my real interest in diet nutrition that eventually led to writing my undergrad dissertation, which investigated whether an active teenager, which was my younger sister Vicky, eating a gluten-free diet with celiac disease gets enough calories per day. It was a great introduction to research and academic writing, although I reread it a few years ago now, Nathan, and while I was clearing out my flat and said to myself, did I really write that? But it was a good learning process. And once I graduated, I worked as a director of sport at Camp Coleman in Cleveland, Georgia, the state just above Florida, in the summer of 2009. And it was while I was working with children and young people, ranging from 3-year-olds to 18-year-olds at this camp, that I realized I wanted to become a PE teacher in the future. So after some post-camp traveling, I returned to England and I worked as a teaching assistant / cover supervisor at a secondary school in Cornwall for a couple of years, predominantly working with year 7 to year 11 students with special educational needs and disabilities, and in the process gained valuable teaching and learning experience through observing great teachers across the school. I also got an opportunity to work with the PE department, for example, helping with lunchtime and after-school extracurricular activities, coaching football, coaching athletics, whilst doing a range of sport awards and qualifications in my free time, like gymnastics, swimming, rugby, football, to name a few, in preparation for my PGCE year and beyond. So following my time at this school, I started my PGCE in PE at Loughborough University, and that was in September 2011. And after surviving that year, and the key word there is survival, I got my first teaching position at a school in Somerset, which is ideal because it was only a few hours away from where I grew up in Newquay, where I went on to teach, as you mentioned a minute ago, for the past 11 years, finishing in July of this year. And to tell the truth, many ups and downs, but overall, I enjoyed my time at the school, working with hardworking, enthusiastic colleagues to improve teaching and learning across core and academic PE, writing and often rewriting Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 programs of study, and developing our Young Leaders program, which has flourished in recent years. So while working as a full-time PE teacher at this school, I completed my master's degree in education in 2014, and that focused on Key Stage 3 gifted and talented views and experiences of PE, quickly followed by a PhD, which I completed in November of last year, which leads me to where I am right now, Nathan. So last month I made the step up, as you did yourself, from secondary to higher education to begin the next stage of my career in academia at the University of Edinburgh, where I'm currently working with undergraduate students on the MA Physical Education degree programme at Moray House School of Education and Sport. It's been a great experience. I've loved every second of it so far, and it's very different from life as a secondary PE teacher, as you can
It
testify.
certainly is. Yeah, that's maybe a conversation for a different day that we can have about that transition from mainstream physical education to higher education. But vast experience, Gary, and I'm sure all of your insights today are going to be really appreciated by the listeners. So let's start with a key question that everyone's going to be asked on this podcast. Why is physical education important to you?
That's a great question, Nathan. For me, physical education can make a significant contribution to children and young people's learning by providing them with the skills and qualities so they can fully engage in a range of recreational or competitive physical activities as part of a lifelong and life-wide journey. I believe PE is a subject that develops important and ongoing fundamental movement skills, develops tactical awareness, develops important rules and regulations, from your fun games to your more structured sporting activities, as well as, probably most importantly to me anyway, Nathan, engaging young children and young people's personal development.
Yeah.
And in particular, their personal learning and thinking skills. So they can be, for example, independent thinkers and team workers within PE, school, and beyond. I believe we as a community of teachers work tirelessly to help children and young people be physically literate, to, for instance, develop their knowledge and understanding, to maintain a healthy, active lifestyle that incorporates positive mental health and well-being. There is, in fact, fantastic work going on at this very moment by Shirley Gray, Rachel Sanford, Ollie Hooper and colleagues at Edinburgh, Loughborough and Cardiff universities in scoping the potential of PE as a core subject, which it should be. PE has strong cross-curricular links across most schools. It's a subject that should get greater recognition than it currently does, in my opinion. And having now retired from competitive running after my varicose vein surgery on both my legs after COVID, I enjoy and will continue to lead and promote a healthy, active lifestyle. And I have physical education to thank for that. Also, we are in fortunate positions as teachers to teach every young child and young person why physical education is important. So PE has been and always will be important to me.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for that. I'm really pleasing to hear you talk about ongoing studies and physical literacy, and it's quite apt considering the consensus that happened only a couple of days ago now, with physical literacy being our relationships with movement and physical activity throughout life. I think that summary in itself is a really good sort of foundation to build upon, and almost kind of centers our values as PE teachers, and whatever we do on top of that. It is really, really important. But if that is our building blocks, then that's a good place to start.
Absolutely.
So obviously you've come onto the pod today, and this is the section where we hand it over to you as the guest to share something that you're interested in or you're passionate about. So what would you like to discuss today, Gary?
I think two things, really. First thing, just share my teaching practice and how I teach, basically, and then move on to my PhD research and share best practice and recommendations. So I'll split it into two parts today, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll start off with in terms of teaching physical education, and since the time I started my PGC at Loughborough, I've had a keen interest in models-based practices like teaching games for understanding, tactical games, sport education.
Influenced by Dr. Ash Casey, I imagine.
Absolutely, yes. Cooperative learning, to name a few. And I use that to plan and teach well-structured lessons that are highly differentiated, inclusive, adapted, and modified, and most importantly, student-led. which also, I consider young people's diverse and complex needs as part of that structuring of those lessons. If I'm honest, I consider myself quite a lazy teacher, in the sense that students take ownership and control of their learning, and that I facilitate rather than lead. And ever since my PGCE days, I've always been comfortable with letting go of the learning and let it be student-led rather than teacher-led, because some of the worst lessons I've ever taught over my career are when I make it teacher-led, and I often struggle with that. So student-led approach really works for me. It's often problem-solve based, with students working together and being physically active within PE lessons, which is crucial because I'm not a fan of inactive, passive participation for large chunks of a lesson. And again, I struggle when I move from active to passive. I like flipped learning. I think it's really important as an approach to help make better connections to learning. So, for example, the last few years, I've asked Key Stage 3 students as part of their independent study to complete a sending and receiving practice linked to transferable techniques and skills, like a chest pass or a bounce pass with any type of ball, football, softball, whatever they've got, in preparation for our following basketball lesson. And sharing resources like YouTube shorts or videos of practices to try as well, in order to make better connections. And I work tirelessly to make assessment meaningful to every lesson, as I'll discuss in a minute.
Sorry, Gary, do you think that's an underused pedagogy in physical education across the board, that flipped learning, the tasks to do at home that contribute to learning in the lesson?
I think in Key Stage 4, like academic, PE and A-level, which I've taught for many years, it's been embedded, but I think it's probably underutilized at Key Stage 3, but it can be really powerful. And when we take TGFU as a model, for example, and tactical games, we often take the skill element out of the game and put it back in. It can make better connections and can make lessons flow, and it's where students can then have that flipped learning task, go away and practice, assess their learning, come back to the lesson and work on it some more with some students. But rather than starting again, which is a common theme through year 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, in terms of those transferable skills. So I think it's something that I'd certainly recommend, and it's something I'm working with students here at Edinburgh about, those transferable skills and using out of lesson context to get students to buy into it. But
great. You also mentioned your approach to allowing students to have ownership of their lessons and giving them responsibility. Now, I had a conversation with Grace Cardiff this morning about meaningful physical education and democratic practices and reflective pedagogy, which is almost like a similar sort of message of allowing the children to have a say and giving them that ownership. It's quite tricky, isn't it, for someone who's recently qualified an ECT, who's maybe still finding their identity as a PE teacher, to maybe let go of that control, particularly when looking to build relationships or set high expectations and standards of behavior. It's it can feel quite there can be some tensions with letting go of that control and responding to the students' reactions. So I guess it's a kind of bit of a leap of faith when you first start, but perhaps something that comes a little bit easier with time.
Yes, I agree. Yes, and I know colleagues that struggle to let go of that learning even a little bit, whereas others are happy to do so. And it's about finding a happy medium and experimenting as well, and using. I often use a lot of my PGC practice to eventually let go of the reins a little bit more and more, and as I get more comfortable. But it's certainly worth, and student-led learning is really important, I think, in order to engage and keep them active. And it's just about experimenting and seeing what early career teachers, what they're happy with and what they're not happy with.
Yeah. So you would. Is that so? You've almost kind of, in a nutshell, described the pedagogies that you you have used as a teacher and that you encourage your trainees at Edinburgh to use. What about your research then? What have you found from your research, and how's that impacting your practice?
Okay, so my PhD, Achieving Mastery and Evolved Grounded Theory of Key Stage 3 Lead Learners' Views on Feedback and Assessment, focuses on how students self-managed their responses to feedback over a 3-year period while studying subjects across Key Stage 3. So, for example, maths, English, science, drama, PE, etc., within Key Stage 3. So that is a curriculum stage for pupils aged 11 to 14 years, starting with year 7, followed by years 8 and 9, for those not so familiar with the English education context. But central to developing the evolved grounded theory was the lead learners' roles as co-researchers, a term that often varies and is misunderstood in practice, but essentially where research participants are involved throughout the study, for example, helping to collect data and analyze it with the researcher or researchers. And it was vital in this study because creating an original grounded theory would have been difficult, from my perspective at least, without the lead learners sharing their voices and being part of the work we did. So just for context, achieving mastery in my research referred to the highest level of achievement within Key Stage 3. And in our context, it went from emerging the lowest level of achievement to developing, followed by securing, and eventually to mastery, the highest level. So before my doctoral study, limited research had looked into how English secondary school pupils perceived and used feedback, particularly those considered high achieving. So to address this sizable gap in the literature, my study aimed to examine 12 Year 7 lead learners. In our context, lead learners are those identified as high ability students. In other contexts, these students might be identified as gifted and talented, for example.
Okay. Yeah.
Their views and experiences of assessment and feedback in Key Stage 3 within the secondary school where I worked as a full-time teacher. I suppose my interpretation of teacher as researcher in this study was carrying out this research and using the findings from it to improve my teaching practice. In other words, I was a teacher when facilitating discussions, interviews, and analysing data with the lead learners, and a teacher when using findings to develop student-centred approaches to feedback and assessment within my lessons. So, having just outlined a little bit of context of my interpretation of my role as a teacher researcher, I'll quickly discuss why I became a teacher as a researcher within this study. So with the constant chopping and changing of feedback and assessment descriptor grades across our school, I informally questioned a number of year 7 to 9 students about assessment and feedback in Key Stage 3, and I was genuinely surprised when they said things like, I don't understand it, or I don't know how to get to mastery. At this point, I decided to reread the school's Key Stage 3 curriculum, assessment, and feedback policies to gain a better understanding of some of the issues that negatively impact students' learning. And after a dozen or so further conversations with pupils, together with my concerns, I wanted to conduct this piece of research using a youth voice in conjunction with a co-participatory kind of framework to truly capture what was happening with assessment and feedback, and most importantly to me, why from the students' perspectives. So it's eventually led to the research question, which was, how did Key Stage 3 lead learner pupils in a secondary school engage with feedback and assessment criteria in their quest to reach the highest standard of achievement in this key stage? And importantly, this was collaboratively done between myself and the lead learners. It wasn't a question which I decided to go with. So we conducted countless informal conversations together with approximately 50 unstructured and semi-structured interviews between March 2018 and July 2020, which the lead learners sometimes led themselves, and I was present to facilitate when necessary. We made use of techniques and procedures specific to Corbin and Strauss's evolved grounded theory, such as theoretical sampling, memo writing, and the constant comparison method. And they were used, and these techniques and procedures facilitated the identification and development of concepts in conjunction with bringing context and process into the analysis that lead learners contributed to. So for example, we aligned the conditions, the actions and interactions and consequences of what they were saying and doing, and choosing quotations that they felt were important to them to help me narrate the storyline of how they managed to self-manage their response to feedback. And by carefully integrating these categories, a substantive grounded theory emerged. And substantive means that in this context specific and hopefully is transferable, enabling other school contexts with comparable characteristics, i.e. those that have high achievers, looking at assessment and feedback to appreciate what was actually happening. Mm-hmm. So the title of my PhD, Achieving Mastery, now that is the core category. So that is the aim of what lead learners were trying to do. They were trying to achieve mastery in everything that they did, successful or not. And the second part, how lead learners self-manage their response to feedback, well, that describes the major process. And that was their attempt to achieve their goal, which was to achieve mastery. And that was collaboratively formed with myself and the lead learners. And branching off this major process of how lead learners self-manage their response to feedback, there are 5 interconnected sub-processes, including mastery networking, and that is in short where lead learners took their feedback to their teachers and or their peers to gain mastery assessment knowledge. Challenging feedback, where lead learners challenge teacher and or peer feedback comments to clarify what they need to do in order to achieve mastery. Making use of resources, that is, engage with learning materials such as exercise books, online resources, textbooks, exemplar work, to see what the mastery bigger picture was. Carrying out mastery research, so that is using things like personal learning checks, which identifies what students need to do to achieve mastery, assessment feedback comments and their exercise book or independent work to see what the mastery assessment criteria was, and finally assessing how to respond to their feedback. So whether they wanted to enter an ongoing reflective cycle of student teacher peer feedback, or, and it was sad to hear this from the lead learners, because often there was an unwillingness to respond directly to feedback, particularly teachers' feedback sometimes.
To the teacher, yeah.
Okay. So instead, they made use of alternative options like networking with their peers outside the classroom, away from the teacher, before coming back potentially into the major process of using things such as challenging feedback, making use of resources. And these 5 interconnected sub-processes are what the students did, the lead learners did to self-manage. They're interconnected because they didn't necessarily do one of the 5. They may have done 4 of the 5, 3 of the 5, helping them their own way of managing it, and learning how they, responded to feedback was fascinating because, it gave me, in my role as teacher's researcher, the findings taught me many things and made me reflect in depth on my practice. And a great example was at the time, in my year 8 badminton lessons, I remember this quite vividly. So for every student, not just the lead learners who I taught, which was probably 2 or 3 of the research sample, to self-manage their response to feedback through teacher, peer, or even self-feedback by carefully scaffolding optional, almost like circuit-like training stations, so which are student-led. So, for example, I'd have a circuit that was like a peer group feedback station circuit, so they could go over and discuss in peer groups. I'd have an optional station in the corner of the sports hall for working with high-achieving mastery students to receive additional feedback, and a station using iPads to observe myself or a high performer demonstrate the game-based and tactical mastery assessment criteria, and why doing X, Y, and Z and so on differentiates from securing, developing, and emerging. So this was kind of to improve their feedback literacy. In addition,
was that in every lesson?
Well, it was.
Was that in every lesson, Gary?
I would start to embed it as soon as I realised what was going on. I would then start to embed this in every lesson.
Okay. And how long would you spend on that sort of feedback circuit that you described?
Well, it was optional, so we could, I might spend 10 minutes, and it would be physically active because, for example, I could be observing you in gameplay, looking at the assessment criteria, and peer assessing you, and then there could be a discussion at the side of the badminton court where we would agree or perhaps disagree. And I could then eavesdrop and then give feedback myself. But it was the way they wanted to respond to their feedback, and given them time. Some students wanted a bit more time than others. So creating opportunities whilst being in a physically active PE lesson, it was challenging to begin with, but again, it's letting go and not giving a structured 15 minutes in the middle of a lesson. It was about having those options and having the criteria on the iPad, so they were at the side of the court, and being able to video if they wanted to respond in that way, if they wanted to go across to the board and look at the assessment criteria. So there was definitely a degree of flexibility, and it allowed them to give constructive, meaningful feedback, which they grew in confidence with. And one of my favorite learning activities was asking the students to challenge my feedback, and this was done in a calm, non-confrontational manner, to develop their own and others' feedback literacy. And I felt that over time, particularly as they moved from year 7, 8 into 9, this approach helped to improve their ability to give that meaningful feedback. And it was great to hear it and obviously, observe it. And I appreciate that not every teacher would enjoy being challenged in this way, but it was something that not only kept me on my toes in terms of my accuracy of my assessment and feedback decisions, but it also, like I said, improved the quality of students' feedback. And it wasn't just, yeah, great, or yes. It was more subjective, and it really started to critique their performance and how can I get better? Why is this important?
Okay. So I'm assuming there were occasions where pupils or children would challenge the feedback you provided them because of misplaced confidence or self-belief or levels of self-confidence. But you made sure that it was always attached to really clear criteria and was a conversation that was in a firm, friendly, constructive sort of environment.
Yes, and it did happen. It happened across year 7, 8, and 9. I felt that this challenge was constructive because it allows us, and I've made one or two mistakes in the past of perhaps not placing in the right descriptor level, and it was a really good example of just sharing our feedback and then looking at it from a different lens and connecting teacher self peer feedback, in that cycle, and using that way of self managing their feedback to go away, come back, and then perhaps challenge and say, I'm doing these things, sir. And then, that's reflective for me. And, even after 12 years of teaching, you don't always get assessment and feedback just right. And, but doing this definitely helps to build, not only your feedback literacy, but the students as well. And helping them to understand the criteria that they're being assessed against, I think is really important. And these strategies did help in these lessons, make those connections a little bit better. So yeah, I think it was great over that 3-year period. And they moved then. I think they're in the second year of sixth form now. The students that I had in Key Stage 3. So, it was great to move up through the school with them. And even after I finished my PhD, then moving into Key Stage 4, we still spent time and, independent time working on their feedback literacy. So it wasn't a case of stopping at the end of year 9 and then that's it. It was built over 5 years. And when you get to teach a group of students that were part of your research for 5 years, it really is powerful. And you can just see your reflective practice move from here to there and evolve. So it was great. It was great from my perspective.
Yeah, powerful. Really powerful. So I'm interested in, obviously your study was based on lead learners, so those that are showing confidence and competence and moving towards higher end targets, which is great. Was there any disparity or similarities between the way other learners manage their feedback that you were aware of? So in that class, obviously you said there was a group of maybe 2 or 3 lead learners, and you were using these feedback and assessment strategies that they were responding well to. But was it the same for all learners in those groups?
There was definitely probably divided in the beginning in terms of working with lead learners as part of the research and then filtering it into lessons. But I quickly established that this was quite powerful stuff, and I want to be able to involve every student, whether it's a lead learner or SEND students, for example, and there was a diverse range of confidence. So it was almost like training the lead learners to then filter it across the class. So they often became experts within the lesson. And then eventually, as I embedded this into my teaching practice, and it took a long time to kind of tweak and evolve, and it continued to evolve. And some of the non-lead learners became very confident and just as articulate as perhaps the lead learners themselves. And especially when, for example, I had a county badminton player who was a non-lead learner within the lesson, and he became the go-to student for feedback and technical practice and working on them with skills and stuff as part of their way of self-managing the feedback I gave them and what he gave them. So as we moved across different areas of the curriculum, we had different experts, lead learner, non-lead learner, but the ability to observe and work with lead learners in the first instance was powerful for the non-lead learners within the class. And we then embedded it as best practice within the class. And not everyone was confident. And it took a long time for those to have the confidence to interact with peers and give feedback, which was daunting for some of them. But over time, it became embedded. So therefore, it was happening across all lessons, and then the least confident ones were then able to feedback, and it was great to see. And it's great to see that progress over not just a block of work. We're talking 3 years of helping them to become feedback literate and use their feedback and how they use it as well, which was really important.
Yeah, I think the term feedback literacy is strikes true in everything you've said there. I think it's really powerful. You've almost encouraged a climate or a culture in your classroom where feedback is a powerful thing. We all know the importance of feedback in moving forward. Also, the point around lead learners, that from my experiences of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from when I've observed lessons, those confident performers are often used as role models for demonstrating techniques or demonstrating abilities and behaviors, but not necessarily how to manage feedback and how to provide feedback. They're often given like coaching roles, perhaps, where they're told to improve an individual's technique or movement patterns, but to actually use lead learners to develop that culture of feedback literacy is quite a unique approach, and something that we should be maybe pushing for
absolutely
more often. So in terms of what you've gathered from your research, what would you be encouraging PE teachers to do daily in their lessons? Whether it's aligned to your research around assessment and feedback literacy or other things, what would be your sort of, if you were speaking to PE teachers that are going into classrooms today, tomorrow, what were you encouraging them to do in terms of best practice?
Well, I think it ties in with my takeaway message, and it's that, you know, young people are valuable stakeholders within PE and education generally, and I encourage schools, teachers, PE teachers to work with them. For example, you know, adapting and modifying curriculum, extracurricular activities so they're more inclusive to engage everybody, or make assessment and feedback more student friendly so students can make, you know, better connections to and between assessment criteria within PE and beyond. But creating space for children and young co-researchers within lessons will give them greater control, involvement, and ownership so they can bring new ideas to the table and possibly make changes to all aspects of PE. I'm certainly not saying we should let children and young people make decisions and run PE departments within school, nor am I saying we need to engage heavily with academic research, which, as you know, can be problematic in terms of logistical and ethical issues. But we can create opportunities as PE teachers and teachers generally to let children and young people speak on matters and, you know, that affect them, and most importantly, act on it. Unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of hearing but not listening going on. So little changes after adult stakeholders conduct youth or student voice. So empowering children and young people to take part in helping PE departments, you know, to find solutions to problems they encounter in their local context and help them make changes if necessary, I think is really valuable. And from my perspective, there isn't much extending beyond student voice, i.e. they talk, you listen. So I hope the findings and recommendations from my PhD will offer teachers, teacher educators, and the research community generally to really emphasize the in co-researching. And there's a paper I'm writing and putting the final touches to that discusses this in further detail, which I look forward to sharing in the future. And I also have published a few British Education Research Association BERA blogs relating to my PhD. The first of which is Pupils' Perspectives on Engaging with Feedback and Assessment in Secondary School, followed by one that came out in June, Developing Key Stage 3 Assessment and Feedback Policy and Practice, Recommendations for English Secondary Schools and Teachers. So, you know, it'll be great that if teachers engage and perhaps read those to see some further ideas and recommendations of what I did and going from there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gary. That's really insightful. It's one of the main aims of my podcast, or the idea behind the podcast, is to make research accessible to those that are in practice, right? Because I often have conversations with trainee teachers that are wanting to read evidence and use evidence to inform their practice, but sometimes the accessibility of those papers are quite challenging. They take hours to read and sometimes require a thesaurus, or they often come knocking on my door and want definitions. So what I think, and also for those that are busy teachers in the classroom that don't have time, I just want this podcast to be a platform for people to listen to conversations and have some key takeaways of what research says, what things work and what things don't work, what the tensions are, and what they can apply to their practice. And what you've mentioned today about feedback literacy and some of the different techniques and pedagogical approaches you used in your classroom whilst you were teaching alongside your research are really powerful. The use of lead learners to role model those positive behaviors and to improve that culture of positive feedback, but also to encourage the children to challenge that feedback as well is a really nice sort of notion. And your piece on on co-construction and co-research and the importance of student voice. I've had 2 conversations so far with yourself and with Grace, who was talking about meaningful PE earlier, where the voice is massive in the democratic, the guiding pedagogies of meaningful PE. So there's a lot of this sort of notion coming through at the minute where students' voice and choice and co-construction and working with can be really powerful. I think what we just need more of is examples of how to do it, and what you've provided today is some of those. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate you taking the time to jump on, and hopefully once the other papers have been released, more than welcome to come on again and share your findings of other work that you continue to do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Nathan, for inviting me on your new podcast today, and for all the hard work you do at the Marjons. I've been following your work for a few years now and have learned and continue to learn from you. So keep up the fantastic work you do, and I'll promise to promote your podcast, and I wish you all the best of it, and I hope you succeed. As long as I didn't bore you or the listeners today, I would love to return at some point in the future to chat, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Excellent. Right, thank you very much, Gary. Top
Pleasure.
work.
Thank you, Nathan.